I'm Craig Bowlerjack, network and NBA announcer. Utah is proud of its athletic teams, but there's another performance Utah is not proud of. The state leads the nation in the abuse of prescription drugs. We have a higher percentage of citizens who misuse prescription drugs than any other state. With a little teamwork, we can do better.
There's an interesting phenomenon here in Utah. Utah is typically viewed as being a population that has fairly low drug abuse incidence when you look at things such as alcohol, the illicit drugs, or even tobacco. But counter to that trend is a fairly high abuse problem with the prescription drugs. And several reasons for that. One of the reasons is the perception of the population. The population in general, not just here in Utah, but all over, view the prescription drugs as being very safe drugs. After all, they're being prescribed by clinicians. You have permission to use them, and certainly your doctor wouldn't give you permission to use something that could do damage or could be harmful for you.
My name is Claudine. I'm a 45-year-old woman from Utah, and I grew up in a small central Utah town. Probably a real atypical addict. I grew up in a home where there was no coffee or alcohol or tobacco of any kind. And in fact, I've still to this day never even smoked a cigarette, but never thought addiction would be something I would have to deal with.
The pain pills people abuse the most are opiate painkillers with names such as Lortab, Oxycontin, and Vicodin. Even though they are prescribed by a physician, they can be just as addictive as the illegal drugs bought on street corners.
In a 10-year period of time, I had 5 major surgeries. I lost a child, a baby, through miscarriage. I had a pulmonary embolism. I had a life-threatening infection in my leg. I had 4 root canals, and then I had my back injury. So in that length of time, I can't even imagine how many prescriptions I had filled for Lortab. And, you know, with that kind of a history, I would hope that a doctor would sit back and say, you know, this is a problem. We do have a problem here, and what can I do to help? One
of the tools that physicians can use to monitor patients or to identify who's having problems is commonly called a Doppler report. It's DOPL, which is the Division of Professional Licensing, which maintains a database of all controlled substance prescriptions in the state of Utah for each person. And a physician can only access that for his own patients, people he's treating. But that report will give him or her a list of every controlled substance prescription that person has filled in the last 90, 180, or even 360 days, and who prescribed it, and where they filled it, and how many pills they got, and what strength.
It takes just 2 minutes for a doctor in Utah to check a patient's history of prescribed medications and to look for patterns of abuse. But not all doctors have been trained to recognize the symptoms of prescription drug abuse.
In general, physicians haven't done too well in looking for addiction or alcoholism and then treating it. And a large part of the problem is that it isn't or wasn't taught very well in medical school and in their training. They're just not comfortable identifying it or treating it. And until recent years, a large part of the problem was, even if you identified a person as having a problem, then what? What do you do?
I think that was probably one of the hardest things I ever did in my addiction, was to go to my doctor. I remember the first time I went to him, I was so afraid to go to him. And I had just, all weekend long, I had just made up my mind I was going to go first thing Monday morning, and I didn't have an appointment or anything. I just got there right at 8 o'clock when I knew he was going to be there. And I took him in a room and sat him down, and I just said, you know, I have a problem. I am addicted to these. You know, and he just kind of patted my knee and said, oh, it's okay. We've got to make sure you're not in pain. You know, we'll deal with that later. Well, you know, in an addict's mind, that's what I wanted him to say. That's what I wanted him to do. You know, he gives me another prescription, take these every 4 hours. You can take 6 of these a day. You know, I went out of there like I was on top of the world because he'd given me what I wanted, and I didn't have to feel guilty anymore. But then, you know, 6 a day wasn't enough. Then it went to 10, and then it went to 12, and then it went to 16.
we have seen a dramatic increase in prescription and opioid, in particular, abuse. When I started working at Dayspring in 1996, there were more alcoholics that needed to be detoxed than opioid addicts. And now it's 10 years later, it's the opposite. We have about 3 to 1 opioid addicts versus alcoholics. And the vast majority of those opioid addicts are prescription drug addicts.
Still, I knew I was out of control, and then I went back to him 2 different times after that and told him I was out of control. Now, I didn't tell him how many I was taking every day, but he didn't take the time to look either to see how many prescriptions I'd had filled. And that's a real problem. With doctors, I think they have too much faith in their patients when they have these powerful, powerful drugs available.
With the increase in prescription drug abuse, there are people who probably wonder why those medicines are still available on the market and by prescription. And the reason they're necessary is that there are people who have medical problems that require treatment with those medications. But when those drugs are not used under a doctor's care, it becomes very dangerous because people don't have the instructions from a physician on how best and when appropriate to use that medication.
One of the big problems with the prescription drugs is that people perceive those as being a very different category of medications or pharmacological agents versus the illicits or even alcohol and tobacco, when in fact they actually oftentimes represent the same pharmacology, meaning that the body really doesn't care whether a certain brain system is activated by morphine or OxyContin versus being activated by heroin.
Utah County citizens are predominantly of one religion. Most church members stay away from cigarettes, tobacco, and alcohol. But prescription drugs are used for non-medical reasons at an alarming rate. In fact, according to some studies, Utah County is the #1 area in the country for prescription drug abuse.
We're Terry and Joanne Petrie. We're the parents of Jordan Cameron Petrie. He died of a heroin overdose in October 10th of 2006. We live in Orem, Utah, in Utah County. He was always precocious. We laugh about how he was a big baby when he was born, and he just sort of came out the gate going. He could, at 9 months old, he could climb out of the crib and open the fridge up and get his own food. He loved cottage cheese and yogurt, and would pry the lids off, and I'd come into the kitchen and find him eating it. And he loved sports. He loved to play all kinds of things and wasn't afraid of hardly anything. His dad coached him a lot. And in fact, I was kind of jealous of the amount of time that Terry was able to spend with all of our boys.
It was actually through sports that we became really close, Jordan and I, and became actually very good friends. And I had a privilege to spend a lot of time as his football coach and then watch him move on into other football programs. And he was our best athlete.
It is often through some kind of sports injury that a young adult will first come in contact with pain-killing drugs. That was certainly the case with Jordan. Even a first exposure can activate brain receptors in a powerful way we are just beginning to understand.
He was injured in football at Orem High School, and he was prescribed painkillers, which were the artificial opiates. And then when he was on his mission, he had a bad intestinal problem. And again, he was prescribed artificial opiates.
Yeah.
And then running for UVSC on their track team and ripping his leg muscle again, he was prescribed those opiates again. And I think subtly and slowly he slipped into an addiction that none of us were aware of. Probably not even he was aware of it.
Yeah.
And then when you can't get the pills, you have to find something somewhere else.
As we've explained, opium-derived pills prescribed by a doctor can lead to a much more dangerous mix of prescription drugs. Sadly, these drugs are available in communities throughout Utah. Most youngsters know where to buy them, and they're expensive. In fact, today, heroin costs less than prescription painkillers. But users believe prescription drugs are safer, which sometimes leads to greater abuse.
There's a pathway or a progression, though. A person, typically a younger adult or older adolescent, might start taking Lortab, and they may get it out of their parents' medicine cabinet because it's there and it's available, or their friends will offer to buy it. It has some value, and they'll start with that, and when Lortab isn't doing enough for them, then they graduate to OxyContin. OxyContin's expensive, and when that becomes too expensive, they run out of things to pawn, or they don't have enough money to buy it. It's a very simple substitution to go to heroin, and I've seen that happen over and over and over again.
I think it's obvious that when you can't get the prescription drugs, that you have to find something elsewhere, and unfortunately in our communities, there are those elements that are bringing illegal drugs into this country and into this county, into the Salt Lake County as well. And they're very willing to give you free samples. They're very willing to find you as a client. And I think Jordan got caught up in that.
Monday, 7:04 p.m.
Hey, buddy, what's up, buddy? Tell me, I need to talk with you. Don't worry, alright? Hey, buddy, it's me, Jimmy. Call me back, please. I need to talk with you. It's good for you. Don't worry. You forget the past. Call me back, please.
One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, why can't he or she just stop? Or if my family were really important to them, then they would just stop. Or if their job were really important, they would just stop, et cetera, et cetera.
I remember the hardest day is when his mom told me that she had talked to Jordan, and he admitted.
What had happened was his older brother was home visiting, and he'd found a spoon with a blackened bottom in the bathroom. And it's the kid's bathroom, and he brought it to me and said, "Mom, I think we have a problem." And we'd known that he was using things like marijuana and ecstasy, that he went to raves, and even cocaine, but those are not nearly as addictive as heroin.
My wife asked a question that Jordan didn't answer, but he answered with his eyes. And she says, 5 years ago, would you have predicted you'd be here in this situation today? And you could tell by the hurt in his eyes he did not want to be there, but he had no way of stopping it.
Yeah, that actually is what. There were two things. I said to him, this spoon, you don't know about this spoon, but this spoon is one of the last spoons we have left from the set. We'd been given as a wedding present. In that case, it was when I talked to him, it was about 4 years ago, the first time. And so we had been married 33 years, and it was one of the last spoons. And I said, you know, when I was given that, we thought they were so nice. I never in my wildest dreams would have dreamt that I would be talking to one of my children about using it for this purpose. Not in my wildest dreams.
The Petrie family hopes that by talking about the life of their son, they can bring attention to how these addictions develop. They feel strongly that such conversations must take place. If not, more of our sons and daughters will pay the ultimate price for addictions that develop after exposure to pain medications.
And it's really tough to describe the feeling that Terry Jordan's using heroin. Oh my, what do we do? Where do we go? Who do we talk to? Where do we turn? And that's such an incredibly helpless feeling.
It is.
And when you do talk about it, people kind of quietly turn away, because this is something, I don't know, it's just something that we don't want to talk about. We do want to get into the open. And I understand, because at first, gosh, I didn't want anybody to know I had a son that had this kind of problem. But I've since learned that that's a very incredibly wrong way to do things, that you need to find help.
Yeah, and it's like their ability to think has been taken from them.
When a patient tells me, I really want to keep my family, it's the most important thing to me, they're not lying to me. That's true. you really have to think about what's going on in the brain when you get addicted. And one way to think about our brain is that there's the outside part of our brain, the cortex, is the part that we think with, it's the part that we talk with, it's the part that we pay our taxes with and drive a car and that sort of thing. And addiction doesn't really affect that part of the brain. The addiction part, the sort of long-standing part that never goes away, is in a more primitive and interior part of the brain. Doesn't respond to, to reason, to arguments, to guilt, or anything like that. It responds only to things that we perceive we need for survival. And so once the addiction takes over that survival part of our brain, then it doesn't matter if anything that's ever been important to you will take a second place to the addiction.
Like the concept that people look at this as a moral failure, that they morally, it's all in their personality. They don't have good characteristics. There's something wrong with them if they can't control this impulse. And that, it just isn't true.
And that's what happens when you are exposed to an addicting drug and you either have a history of addiction or you have a family history of addiction. The family history is probably responsible for at least 40 to 65% of the risk for addiction. And I don't mean that you grew up with somebody who was alcoholic, but that genetically your blood relatives have had addiction in the past. You may never have known them, you may never have lived with them, you may never have even known that they were addicted, but you have the same genetics that you carry forward. And even unbeknownst to you, you may end up with this risk, and then when you expose your brain to an addicting drug, it can activate that addiction, and you do not get to vote on that. It's something that can happen unwittingly to you. It's not something that you voluntarily do.
There is another reason to have a serious discussion about how to deal with the increase in prescription drug abuse. A recent study by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services showed a new trend. The age of abuse is trending downward. High school and junior high kids are taking prescription painkillers at an alarming rate. They find pills wherever they can, and the source of their pills should alarm concerned parents.
I'm an adolescent medicine doctor. My patients are 10 to 20 years of age. With all of my patients, I ask them what drugs are being used at the schools that they attend and if they've tried any of those substances. The most common substance of abuse among the patients I see is marijuana. Other substances of abuse are alcohol and cigarettes. Prescription drugs are an important substance of abuse, although not the most common substance of abuse. But a survey that was done in 2004 found that 9.3% of high school seniors had used the drug Vicodin.
Something I've observed over the last few years, and a growing concern that I have, is the nature by which teens are having exposure to substances. Particularly with prescription drugs, there's a higher level of access, for whatever reason, to medications that have previously had either less appeal or less access. So for instance, adolescents these days commonly can have access to controlled substances of a variety of sorts. Those that I find to be most problematic currently are opiates.
If you're exposed to substances during the time when brain circuits are being modified, late adolescence, early adulthood, then you're changing the way your brain is being engineered in a very subtle way that's very important. Receptors for nicotine, for dopamine, for other brain receptors are being modified according to which circuits are firing and which circuits are not.
So-called pharma parties or trading parties are becoming more popular among kids who use prescription drugs. The way these will work is kids will raid their medicine cabinets at home if they know a parent's had surgery in the past and maybe there's some leftover painkillers, or a sibling is being treated for ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They'll take the stimulant and go to a friend's house where other kids will meet and exchange or trade different prescription drugs.
When parents find out that their child has been using some kind of a substance, whether it be alcohol, prescription drugs, or illicit drugs, probably the most important step a parent can take is opening up means of communication with their teen. I find that this has been the most problematic area where parents react and they want to put ultra constraints on their teens, which only makes a teen want to react and be defiant against that parental control. By no means am I advocating that the parents should allow them to continue access with peers who are known to be abusing substances, but rather invite their child to explain the reasons why they have even engaged in substances.
Youngsters definitely want to hear from their parents about the risks of prescription drugs. It's part of the job description, and according to experts, the warnings of a parent often get through even when it seems no one is listening.
Teenagers, of course, are going to consider their friends to be very important in their lives, because part of being a teenager and progressing to adulthood is finding independence and figuring out what your own identity is. And often teenagers will do things that make their parents feel like they're not so important and that their opinions don't count. But what they really want is for their parents to be in their lives, to not be their friends, because they got friends who are their own ages, but they want their parents to be their parents and to create structure and rules and to be consistent with those. Because when they have those in place, they really perform to their best. School is a major stressor for kids, whether it's being able to fit in or worrying about getting good grades. Maybe it's wondering if they're going to flunk out. And the importance of fitting in and peer pressure is probably the major stressor in schools. And a kid may not fit into the group that he or she wants to fit into and will then turn to a group that has something to offer, which may be drugs.
Addiction to prescription drugs cannot be separated from other forms of addiction disease. You probably know someone who struggles with addiction to prescription drugs. You definitely know someone who has addiction disease, even if you don't recognize it. Addiction disease is a disease of the brain. Probably 1 in 5 of us are susceptible to the disease. Prescription drugs offer one more expression of this all too common disease.
There's still a negative attitude toward addiction and alcoholism. It is stigmatized, and it's not treated medically like it should be. And that stigma leads to discrimination, and discrimination by family members, by friends and neighbors, by insurance companies, and even people in recovery encounter some of that stigma and discrimination. Patients that go into a physician and tell them openly and honestly that they're a recovering addict aren't always treated with the same respect that they should be.
That this psychology of thinking good thoughts, of setting goals, of step-by-step improvement is a very important psychology. I would say in treating addiction that the psychology of improvement is as important as the medications, but both are critical.
If you're concerned that you may have an addiction, the key is being honest with the people around you. If you're honest with the people that care about you, you're more likely to get help. And those people around you that do care about you, my suggestion is that you be honest with them, that you not be blaming, that you view this as a chronic illness. I often liken it to diabetes or high blood pressure. I think support's the key. One of the things that often happens is people will lie. I think it's easier to view that as a symptom of the illness and not get wrapped up in control or fights.
You know, I think talking about it is probably the very biggest help to an addict, because more than anything, I think I found out I wasn't the only one. There were so many people around me that had the same problems, felt the same way, and I knew I wasn't crazy. And you find out that you're not a bad person trying to be good. You're an addict. You're a sick person trying to get well. And that was the thing that I think I really had to focus on that saying a lot in the first month or two, because there's so much guilt associated with addiction. You don't remind yourself often enough that it is a disease. It's just like any other disease, cancer or diabetes or whatever. But there's so much shame involved with it that, you know, you hold on to that instead of getting the help that you want.
We need to love each other no matter what, and be willing to get in there and fight the fight, because we are separate individuals and human beings who go through life on different ways and with different struggles and different challenges, and we can't turn our back on each other, and that was the hardest thing.
Right. Let me ask this question. The question I have to ask: if somebody's dying from cancer, we embrace them at church.
That's right.
If somebody is dying from prescription drugs or illegal drugs, we don't embrace them. And I need to know what the difference is.
I think the reason I am so excited to get this message out there is because I know that it can help people. The days I think about laying on my couch sobbing because I didn't know where to turn. I didn't know who to go to get help, and I needed it and I wanted it so desperately, but I didn't know where to turn. I remember going down the freeway about 6 months after I'd gotten out of the hospital, and I remember I was happy. I felt real joy, and I remember it took me by surprise that I really felt joy, and it wasn't because of a high from a pill. It was true, unadulterated joy. And if I can get this out to people and help them understand that there is joy after drug abuse, there is happiness and acceptance and love, then it will make what I went through worthwhile to me.
Addiction is no game, whether it's prescription drugs or any other addiction. But it's a contest we can win, working together as a team. We know what it takes: understanding, support, treatment, and patience. Utah communities are famous for teamwork. Learn more about addiction. Offer support whenever you can. Make sure your community provides treatment opportunities. Be patient with those who suffer. We can beat addiction disease.